Thanks for inviting me here, and I'll talk about this research project that I've had together with my colleagues Jonas Anselm and Björn Wallsten, which is no longer ongoing, but it ended perhaps 1 year ago or so, for which we had the overarching aim of studying the conflicts that we saw around the country brewing around from around 2005 perhaps, but really proliferating around 2014 or so. And our overarching aim then was to study these conflicts and answer the question why do these conflicts arise at this point in time. So we studied the media debate around mining. We studied specifically the establishment and later bankruptcy of the Greenfield mine in Pajala, a community north of the polar circle. We studied the city transformation of the city of Kiruna, which also lies north of the polar circle, which this city transformation entails actually the movement of most of the entire city center, due to mining, of course. And we studied also the very intense conflict around the proposed lime quarry in Oinareskogen at Gotland. But instead of just presenting these paper for paper or case for case, I try instead to conceptualize some of our findings in terms of what we call conflicting imaginaries. That is different ways of understanding what mining is, ideas, visions and norms about mining, what the mine does, for whose benefit a mine exists, and in relation to what power dynamics a mine operates. So we like the concept of imaginary because we think it adds a temporal dimension to it, which goes back in time to notions of how mining used to be, and it taps into the kind of recent history of mining, when mining was very central to Swedish industry in the middle of the 20th century, and it also goes into the future, stretches into the future, and activates, so to say, visions about the mining of the future, the very high-tech, remote-controlled mining of the future. So that is why we think this concept of imaginary is worthwhile to use. And I will just very briefly go through a number of such imaginaries which we have found in our research that are surrounding Swedish mining in the 21st century. There is one, the notion or imagination of mining as an example of greedy extractive capitalism, which is somehow very, very typical of capitalism, and it is based on the greed that is inherent to modern capitalism, or perhaps even to mankind, to take stuff from the earth, which doesn't really belong to you, in this way of thinking. And it is also based on the vision of the earth as very fragile. It can easily be hurt by man, and we should take better care of resources because they are not infinite. Whereas mining, in the modern version at least, seem to assume that resources are indeed infinite. And a slight variation on this imaginary is the idea of mining as an example of colonial extractive capitalism, where mining is very much in representative of the state as well as a global mobile capital, which is used to extract resources from areas where indigenous or local people are living but are not able to make their voice heard. So mining as a colonial venture that threatens local ways of life. And then we have a much different imaginary around mining, which presents it as totally the opposite. It is a venture that is responsible. It's the duty of developed countries like Sweden to actually do mining, because we have better environmental regulations than other countries, such as other mining countries, such as China and India and Brazil. So it is irresponsible of us not to do mining, because it's better that it happens here than in countries where people suffer in the mining business. And also, it's our duty to supply the minerals and metals that will be necessary in the future when we transition into a low carbon society. For example, windmills will need lots of rare earth metals, and it's our responsibility to supply those. And a part of this imaginary is also that Sweden and the European Union should have better resource security. We should not rely on China to supply us with the metals. So that is also, in that sense, a duty of Sweden to supply these minerals, so that we are not reliant on other countries. And we also have a vision of mining as a kind of romantic endeavor, which harkens back to which I mentioned before, the Sweden of the 1950s, or even before, when mining was very central to Swedish export and the Swedish production industry. So this way of looking on mining is as a source of local communal growth. You often hear referrals to Kiruna, which is totally a city in the north of Sweden, totally based on mining, and where mining has historically offered the huge percentages of the work opportunities in the community. So here in this imaginary lies a hope that mining will supply business for vulnerable, depopulated communities. And in this, of course, is not only a romanticism about how it used to be, but also a very deterministic way of thinking that this mine, if it comes to fruition or materializes, is the only hope we have of turning this trend of depopulation and degrowth that we have suffered for decades. And then we also have an imaginary or a way of envisioning mining which focuses on mining as an export revenue, that Sweden has historically been great at mining, and we should keep on being that. It's important for Swedish exports, it's important for Swedish industry on a very national level. And in this is also a contradictory notion that we are sometimes presented as a still great mining nation, and sometimes it's more stressed that we have been a great mining nation, but we have lost this edge because we have not invested enough in the mining industry, and it's imperative that we retake this position or entrench it and keep on being as good as we are. And then finally, I would lift up the neoliberal imaginary around mining, which focuses on mining as a source of commodities for sale, just like any other commodity. It's no different producing an intangible commodity to producing iron ore or extracting iron ore. It's just a commodity to sell on a free, open market. And this goes not only for the metals themselves or the minerals themselves, but also actually for exploration permits and mining concessions. These are also commodities that you can sell on the market. And also a key aspect of this imaginary is that everybody actually stands to gain from mining. There is no losers in this game. There are only winners. And it's this neoliberal imaginary which is the foundation for Swedish mining, at least since the beginning of the 90s. And here the Swedish Minerals Act of 91 is key because it's very much based on this neoliberal way of thinking about mining. It has a number of main principles, which I would stress the ease of access for investment capital, that you dismantle borders, natural boundaries, so it makes it easier for foreign investors to come into Sweden and invest in mining. It's also the abolishment of state-led exploration. You remove the crown share, the right of the state to claim a share in all mining operations. And it also removes the suitability precondition, that there is no longer any check on applicants as regards financial and financial soundness, I would say. So basically anybody could come in and get approved as a mining operator. And the central thing here is also that mining becomes regarded as a private matter between the community or the municipality on the one hand and the mining company on the other hand, and the state is sort of removed from the equation. And it also becomes a purely legal matter between the regulatory authorities, which is the Swedish Mining Inspectorate, the County Administrative Board, and the Environmental Court on the one hand, and the mining company on the other. So the key ideas that form the basis for this Minerals Act of 91, I would say, is privatization, decentralization, and liberalization. And important to stress here is that it's not privatization, perhaps in the sense that all companies are private, because we still have the state-owned LKAB mining company, which remains throughout a very important mining actor. But it's rather privatization in the sense that more private actors are actively invited to come into the mining scene. And if we then move forward 20 years to 2012, we see that this imaginary is still very much alive when the then liberal conservative government released their mineral strategy, which is named Towards a Sustainable Usage of Swedish Mineral Assets, Creating Growth for the Whole Country. Just a moment. Which is kind of produced as a under pressure, I would say, from partly the left oppositional parties, which wants the government to do something for the sparsely populated north and actually signal that they care about them and that they care about the mining industry. And also under pressure from the European Commission, which wants every mining country in the Union to supply or produce a strategy for how the Union can achieve minerals or raw materials security. So it's a statement of intent from the government that the mining industry is key to Sweden, and they signal that we have to speed up permitting processes for this reason. And it is very much based, or it has this rhetoric again about that everybody wins. This is not a no-lose game. Everybody stands to gain from this this strategy. So it's a very typical, it's a product of a very neoliberal way of thinking, I would say. It's based on growth through private initiatives, and it's very little, if anything, of actual commitment of state funds. It's very much talk about that the state regards mining as important, but there is very little commitment of actual money in this. So because of this, it's actually a product or a strategy that makes nobody very happy. It doesn't make the mining opposition happy, of course, because it's quite mining friendly, but it doesn't either make the mining industry very happy because it doesn't really do anything. And what I would stress on a more theoretical level here is that the neoliberalization that we see at work in the mining politics of Sweden is a trend to equalize, in a sense. And by this I mean that the neoliberal imaginary has a tendency to regard, for example, all capital as equal. It doesn't really matter where capital comes from. It's, as long as it's put to use, it's good. And as long as capital generates growth, this is good because all growth is also equally good. Growth anywhere in the country will end up in a common pool of resources or welfare. And this welfare is for everybody in the country's benefit. And it also tends to regard mineral extraction as just any kind of capitalistic or commercial activity equal to any other kind of commercial activity. It doesn't really assume that mining is a different kind of commercial activity, which perhaps would entail extra responsibility from the state in regards to risk management or environmental risk management or things like that. Or that communities should be shielded from the boom-bust cycles that mining is very much associated with. And it also tends to regard the municipalities as a market actor, just like any other market actor. They are supposed to compete with each other in Sweden, other municipalities in Sweden, and municipalities and regions abroad on the global free market for investment capital. And also, which is very important, I would say, is that simultaneously as regarding the municipality as a market actor, it's also supposed to be a government actor, a sub-government actor, or a sub-state actor on equal terms with the state. It has the same capacities and liabilities, it's assumed. So the government, the municipality is assumed to be able to do pretty much what the central state can do. It's supposed to supply housing for companies. It's supposed to be able to properly evaluate the environmental risks and so on. And this equalization, which is apparent in the neoliberal way of looking at mining, it disregards the difference which are present in the political and economic geography of Sweden. It tends to paper over or suppress the fact that we have actually unequal socio-economic power relations. We have a historical memory of conflict. We have unequal patterns of industrialization and deindustrialization and so on. So what this imaginary does not acknowledge, for example, is that decentralization puts many municipalities in a very vulnerable position. The municipality does not have the same financial strength or the same financial capacities as the state has. It can never overspend, for example. It is completely reliant on the funds it receives from taxes and from the state. It cannot go beyond that pool of the resources. And for example, when the state has removed its subsidies for housing in the beginning of the 90s, this has made municipalities totally reliant on attracting investments, for example, mining. This imaginary also disregards or does not acknowledge the existing center-periphery relations in Sweden, where, for example, we have a head office often located to regional centers, often Stockholm, the capital. And of course, this means that tax revenues end up in the capital or the regional capital, rather than in the sparsely populated municipalities where the mining activity takes place. So these unequal center-periphery relations is also a source of grievances where local municipalities or local communities, rather, I would say, raise the question: why should we sacrifice our local environment for the supposed general or national good? It also disregards that we have a colonial legacy, especially in the north of Sweden, where we have an indigenous Sami community or several communities, which of course have a modern history of being very forcefully regulated by the state. For at least for the reindeer part of the Sami population, which is not all Sami by any means, a mining activity can almost never be a good thing. In relation to reindeer herding, it's almost by definition a negative activity or have negative consequences. And this also relates to another aspect which is assumed, or rather not acknowledged in this neoliberal imaginary, which is that competing interests might actually be impossible to reconcile with each other. Because the mineral strategy and the whole neoliberal imaginary tends to assume that competing interests are possible to align and reconcile. Whereas, for example, reindeer herding and other environmental interests can be quite impossible to reconcile with an actual mine. And finally, I would stress that it disregards that there are different kinds of financial capital at stake in mining. We have the more speculative kind, which is usually at play when we talk about the so-called financialization of mining, which is never really aimed at getting a long-term sustained growth in a local community. And then we have the more long-term patient capital, which aims to stay, so to say, for decades. And for a local community, it's very, very different what type of capital it is that is invested. And for all these reasons, which I have mentioned here, what is not acknowledged in this imaginary, we say that we can speak of this as a depoliticized imaginary, because it does not really recognize the political potency or the political conflicts which are at stake when we talk about mining. And not in a sense that people that stands behind or represent this imaginary try to suppress conflict, but rather that it presumes simply that there are no fundamental conflicts of interest which can never be reconciled. If there are differing opinions, these are usually due to special interests, egotism, or ignorance, and they can always be overcome with mediation or more knowledge or something like that. So this, what I have talked about so far, this imaginary is dominating Swedish mining for perhaps 20 years, and it doesn't really happen very much because there isn't that much interest in Swedish mining, at least from foreign investors. Until prices really start to spike around 2005, I think the rise is visible. And then it reaches a peak around 2010. And what happens then is that these latent conflicts, you could say, really proliferate around the country. And we see intense, sustained protests from the very south to the very north. We have one conflict around the proposed lime quarry, as I mentioned before, in Ojnareskog in Gotland, which goes on for more than a decade, from around 2005, and finally ends when the government reluctantly goes in and stops the mine or the quarry from materializing. And this is a conflict that many people involved in it describes as the most important and severe environmental conflict in the country since nuclear power, nuclear power controversy in the 80s. We see the formation of large and very diverse resistance networks where local and national action groups, together with academic experts, environmental NGOs, and also, crucially, I would say, state agencies are working together to protest several of these mining proposals or proposed mines. For example, the Environmental Protection Agency, which historically has often been on the other side of the fence, so to say. It's not really always perceived as a friend of local environmental movements. And these action groups these networks of resistance rather, are very good at connecting their different imaginaries together, and by doing so, creating a very forceful opposition to mining or the mining policy. And likewise, we see the people who are in favor of many of these mining proposals mobilize the oppositional imaginaries, the more mining-friendly imaginaries. Also from very different viewpoints. For example, the local community in Pajala has a totally different perspective on the mine than the company, but they work together because they share a common interest. And eventually, after more than a decade of quite intense conflicts, this all reaches something of a standstill. Partly due to one important court decision which has made demands on mining companies' environmental impact assessments much more. They have raised the demands on those, which makes both the Mining Inspectorate of Sweden and the mining companies themselves quite uncertain about how things will, or how proposals will be evaluated in the future. Which is quite in contradiction to the simultaneous push from the government to keep on making permitting processes more efficient and speeding them up. So we have both these developments going on at the same time. And we see the Mining Inspectorate, which is a very, very small agency, being quite swamped in work, in controversy, and so they refer several of these most controversial projects to the government for an ultimate decision. And that's where it stands pretty much today. We have several proposals at the government's desk for decision, and we have this uncertainty in the air about how environmental impact assessments will be, or what demands actually will be put on the applicants in the future. And of course, important to mention, a reason for this kind of pause in the controversies is that prices have dropped, as I shown here. So there are not as big an interest any longer in Swedish mining. So, answering the question, finally, why does this politicization that we have studied or found happen? Well, the most direct cause is, of course, that there is this mining boom, which leads to a great interest in Swedish mining, and then, hence, controversy. Without this interest, there is, of course, no reason for conflict. And the seed for conflict, or the ground for conflicts, is laid, so to say, by these deregulations and privatizations, which I sketched before. So when all this capital and this interest comes into Sweden on this deregulated terrain, conflicts ensue. That was the first reason. The second reason, I would say, is that you can say that this really speaks to the political potency in the environment, that it's very possible to mobilize political resistance by tapping into the environment in some sense. Of course, people have very different views of what is the environment. Some people say we fight for our local living environment. Some people say they fight for the status of the environmental code, but in some sense this is all related to the environment. So we'd say it's proof of the political potency in the environment. And third, I guess you could speak of a more generalizable pattern where depoliticization is followed by politicization. If you suppress or you don't acknowledge conflicts, these tend to surface anyway, or in response even. And finally, I would say that the retreat of the Swedish state from activities like mining for over 30 years is an important reason. If local communities could see that the state was actually present and able and willing to back mining establishments up with subsidies for housing, cleaning up after the mine has closed, and regulating and taking care of the environmental issues. If this presence was there, I think not all, but many of these conflicts would not happen. And also, if there is no visible state, no visible governmental presence, or no visible greater good in connection to the mine, it's hard to sell the argument that we do this all together. This is for the reason of a greater good, that we kind of sacrifice our local environment. Yes, I would end there and hope this has been possible to understand.